The
but
pine
sorry.
tree.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah,
sorry to
right.
interrupt you.
No. As far as Addis goes, that's really easy to show where these particular characteristics come from. Now, and they're continually restated by a number of authorities and scholars, modern scholars, and I have that in that ebook that I just created. But of course, this stuff wasn't written down until hundreds of years after Christ supposedly lived. So the apologists like to say that the Addis story was based on Christianity and so forth because there's no writing down of this.
Right.
We're talking about, again, mysteries. We're talking about, this is the God is certainly pre-Christian, without a doubt, or should I say pre-Common Era, without a doubt. And from Diodorus, we can glean certain things. We can glean his death and his mourning. We've got priests parading around with his image, which is a pretty common motif of a resurrection. They're saying, in the Egyptian, they would say, "This is Osiris. He has risen." And they would have his image. They would bring out his image out of the temple and say, "See, here's the God. He's back again." And so, if you have priests parading around with an image, it's usually indicative that the God has risen. So to say that Addis was a dying and rising God is pretty solid. Certainly, it's already been stated by some expert. This Mettinger, for example, Dr. Mettinger is an extremely well-respected expert on the resurrection motif. And that motif was there, there's no doubt about it. Then you have the whole virgin birth mystery again that is in certain texts, but these texts now, in order to make kind of a list, you would have a problem with digging up Latin resources or Greek resources that are not readily translated, that are not easily found. Nobody's reciting these things. It tends to talk over the heads of the masses.
Sure.
This is why we have to bring it forth in multiple ways. One way is to bring it forth in the digest that you've produced, which is much, it's like very striking. Okay, here it is.
Sure.
Now, is this how the ancient world would have seen it? Well, in the case of Addis, yes. The Christians are actually complaining. Hey, they're copying us. They've got all the elements. So they must have seen it as being the same,
Yeah.
It's not just like some kind of weird interpretation that we're putting on it right now. We're not putting a spin on it. The Christians themselves were saying this. These guys are imitating us. So if they're that close to them, now, as I point out, this death and resurrection motif in the spring is unquestionably pre-Christian. We find it in the myth of Persephone. We find it in the story of Tammuz, Dumuzi, in the Sumerian. It's been traced to the 3rd millennium by the same expert Mettinger. The story of Persephone, who dies and goes, well, they never say she dies, but she goes into Hades, which is the underworld where most people are dead. Right. She goes into Hades and she rises out. Persephone's rise was celebrated at least probably annually, but her rise out of the underworld is when the spring comes. And I remember being taught this as a child. This was one of the fascinating myths that I actually understood. When you strip these myths of their nature-worshipping background and their astrotheology and so forth, they become mystifying and strange and weird and unpleasant to deal with. But when you put it into a sensible context like that, then look at that. Well, of course that makes sense. And so the placement of Christ's death and resurrection at Easter, springtime, is so convenient because that's when it was already being celebrated. The death and the resurrection of the god or the goddess was already being celebrated at that time. There's no two ways about it. Now, we have these Addis celebrations going on at that exact time. Are they imitations of a guy who lived in Judea, or are they archetypical representations of the spring celebration? Which makes more sense to you?
Good point. I always thought it was very arrogant of Christian scholars to automatically assume that anything that happened over past 1 AD could have been ripped off from Christianity. Even in the festival of Addis, they had marked that at about the 2nd century A.D. in Rome, where they were pegging Attis to a pine tree, and they were putting him in a tomb for 3 days, and he was resurrected. This is historical information. Well, I haven't particularly sourced it, but they come back with the Christians come back with the fact that that had to have been stolen. I just think it's incredible that that's the disposition that they take. We have about 15 minutes left, and let's jump around to some of these other gods that are on this site.
Okay.
So we like, for example, why don't you go into Dionysus a little bit?
Okay. Well, Krishna is in order, so let me go to the Krishna one, because that's
okay. Yes, sure.
Such an interesting. I love it. This really has just allowed for more of this wonderful information to be dug up. So, the people crying foul about the word virgin, describing Krishna's mother. First of all, as far as I'm concerned, as you can tell if you read my book, Sons of God, Krishna, Buddha, and Christ Unveiled, neither Krishna nor his mother are real people. So you got to disabuse yourself of the notion that these characters that we're talking about were real people. They don't have genitalia, and they're not considered to be, penetrable or sulliable or whatever. Right. They're always virginal. Even Zeus, with all of his randy exploits, was considered a virgin.
Right.
He's called Parthenos. This goes on. It's just these are myths. Okay, so if you start looking at the mythology behind Krishna and Devaki, you start seeing, well, Krishna looks like a very, very much a solar myth, a sun god, and Devaki is starting to look a lot like a dawn goddess. She's the incarnation of Aditi, who is the virginal mother goddess of the dawn. In going back to the Rig Veda, prior to the Common Era, 1,000 years or more.
Right.
So you have this concept of the virginal dawn giving birth to the sun every morning. You know how the morning sky is so clear and clean and refreshing, and then if you have this like rosy-fingered dawn, as Homer put it, you've got this brilliant morning sunlight coming up. It's just very striking, and you can see why it would be considered virginal.
Absolutely.
Just absolutely pure and newly born, and so. There's that case to be made, which I make in Sons of God, about Krishna's mother being incarnation, or she is the incarnation of Aditi in traditional mythology, and the Aditi is the sun goddess. But interestingly enough, there's a myth attached to her where she, as a teenager, presumably a virgin teenager, eats the seed of a mango and becomes pregnant. So, Krishna's mother very much was a virgin mother. Whether or not she is when she gives birth to Krishna is the issue. However, they go on and on because, she had other children before him. Again, we're talking about a mythical character. We're not talking about a real person, like the Virgin Mary, who supposedly has other children. In fact, they end up with the same or similar number of children. There's a perpetual virginity going on here. But if you so insist, change the word to chaste instead of virginal, and call it a miraculous birth. The difference is the same.
Right. Krishna
was born of a miraculous birth. So now we can move on from there. But all of this stuff is written down, and it's quite fascinating. Oh, by the way, there is this virgin birth mystery in Indian texts. The Mahabharata goes into it. We have a goddess, the goddess Kunti, says, without a doubt, through the grace of that God, I once more became a virgin. So we have this born-again virginity mystery going on. And She gives birth. She is a virgin goddess mother figure. So this is like, this motif should be accepted by now, that it's pre-Christian, that it is absolutely derivative with Christianity. Dionysus, same thing. Whether or not his mother Semele could be deemed a virgin, is it stated in the ancient texts that she was Parthenos? Parthenos, by the way, if you can't find this stuff, go look up the word Parthenos, genetically. You look up these words. This is the word that's used by scholars to describe this virgin birth phenomenon. I've seen it used in describing Neith, again, this Egyptian goddess dating back. It's like 7,000 years, this concept of the Virgin Mother goes back. 7,000 years, right? You don't necessarily see this. They don't spell it out. They use the word Parthenos. And if you don't know Greek and you don't know the other languages, can't research in foreign languages, you won't find this. It's not in the encyclopedia.